Good afternoon. My name is Bob Elias, and as chairman of the Associated Student Speakers Program, I'd like to welcome you to our first afternoon lecture. Today we have with us Mr. Uri Avnery, who is a member of Israel's parliament and is perhaps the most controversial figure on the Israeli scene. Mr. Avnery came to Palestine at the age of 10 and began his career by joining the Irgun, which is the organization that was fighting the British. After being seriously wounded in the war, Mr. Avnery began editing and publishing Ha'olam Hazeh, which has become Israel's largest and widest-selling weekly news magazine. Mr. Avnery has written numerous books. His latest, Israel Without Zionists, outlines his overall outlook for Israel's future. Today, Mr. Avnery will speak on a plan for peace, and a brief question and answer period will follow. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Uri Avnery.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. It's very nice after 20 campuses on the east side, the east coast, to be in a place so much like Tel Aviv, climate like Tel Aviv, a little bit worse. The city seems to be beautiful like Tel Aviv, and even the student body somehow reminds me of Tel Aviv here. It seems so much alive outside. Difference is, of course, that coming from Israel, what you have here, I'm told, is smog, which we have not yet, but are on the way of producing. But we have a war which you have not here, not this kind of war. And the quietness of the scene of the United States is something which is very remote from the atmosphere of the place from which I come. Actually, I left my country about 3 weeks ago for this tour because it was such a quiet time in the Middle East. Nothing at all was going to happen. Everything was set for peace talks. We were well on the way to peace. The defense minister of Israel, Moshe Dayan, has just said that we are in the last stage of the war because all the parties concerned, the Egyptians, the Russians, the Americans, all want peace. So I felt assured I can leave the place for a month and everything be nice and quiet. The next day, the whole thing blew apart. We had a terrible civil war. And I just told the journalist with whom I was speaking that few people in the United States can have any conception of what kind of civil war that was over there. If it is true, as is generally assumed, that the 20,000 Palestinians were killed or wounded in that massacre, it is the equivalent of 2 million Americans. 500,000 Americans killed, 1.5 million Americans wounded. I don't think you had this even during the World War. And then, of course, Gamal Abdel Nasser died. The major figure in the Arab world disappeared, and now the thing is wide open again. The point I'm trying to make in Israel, that I'm trying to make here, is that the major factor in the Middle East is not the relationship between the Arab world as such and Israel, not personalities like Gamal Abdel Nasser, but the fact that in the Middle East you have a people which has become a people without a national identity, which is haunting the Middle Eastern stage like a ghost of the father of Hamlet, in which we have to lay at rest if we want to have any kind of peace settlement at all. And I mean the Palestinian people. I think the major break of the small party which I represent, or the peace movement in Israel in general, is that we have come to realize that there is a Palestinian people, that there exists a Palestinian nation, that we cannot have any kind of settlement, any kind of peace, any kind of new life in the Middle East if we don't find a place in the Middle East for the national aspirations of the Palestinians. How this came about is a long story. Usually, I think you hear either of two stories which you diametrically opposed, either of which you have to accept completely, lock, stock, and barrel. And if you don't, you're being accused by one side as being imperialists, reactionaries, Zionist agents, or on the other side of being murderers, Fida'in, Fatah sympathizers, and whatever. The one story goes like this. There was an Arab land called Palestine, Palestine in Arabic. It has been an Arab land for 1300 years. One day, a bunch of Jews sent there by imperialism descended on that poor country, drove out the rightful owners of the country, both as a people and as individuals, took possession of that land, and since then, the Palestinians are fighting for their national rights and will go on fighting for their national rights until this awful structure called the State of Israel will be destroyed, or in more polite terms, replaced. The other story goes like this. Jews in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, at the end of last century, were living in a state of oppression, had to face terrible pogroms, saw greater dangers looming on the horizon. They decided that they want to have a homeland of their own. They naturally thought about the homeland of their history, their religion, their people. They came back to Palestine peacefully, buying the land with money, and a perverse bunch of Arabs, calling themselves Palestinians, tried to kill us, tried to cut our throats, and they are still at it until today, and there's nothing we can do about it except defend ourselves until, if ever, these perverse people will stop being perverse, see that we are nice and beautiful people, and live with us at peace. These are the two stories, and it's very hard to imagine that they relate to exactly the same circumstances. And you can't tell either to the one side or to the other side that we accept your story 99%, but if you tell an Arab who follows official Arab propaganda line that you think he is 99% right, he'll tell you that you are a Zionist agent. And if you tell somebody who follows the Orthodox Zionist propaganda line that he is 99% right, he'll tell you that if you are non-Jewish, then you are an anti-Semite. If you are Jewish, you are a Jewish self-hater, or even both. The fact is that what really happened was by far more complex. It cannot be described in a few words, but I'll try to give you an outline of how things look to my friends and I. What actually happened was that in the end of last century, when the Jews were famed with the massacres of Kishinev, many other places throughout Eastern Europe, many of them came to realize that there's no hope at all for them in Europe all attempts to integrate in European society have failed. Terrible things might happen, and of course later did happen. There is no way out except somewhere, someplace, to find a Jewish homeland where Jews will be masters of their own fate, where Jews will live among themselves. This was basically Zionism, certainly a liberation movement for the Jews oppressed in Europe. In the beginning, they did not have any specific country in mind at all. The founder of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, when he wrote his famous book, did not think about any particular country. If at all, he preferred Argentina. He was thinking about a country where Jews could create their national homeland, and he coined his famous phrase, for the people without a country without a people, an empty country. And only when Herzl came into contact with the masses of the Jewish people in Eastern Europe did he become convinced that only the name of Palestine, only the memory of Palestine, with their profound emotional, religious, historical associations, could set in motion those masses of people, could set in motion this big historical process of creating a Jewish homeland anywhere. And then the Zionist movement, congregating for its first Congress in Basel, Switzerland in 1897, I think, adopted this program of creating a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. At exactly the same time, throughout Palestine, throughout the Middle East, actually throughout Africa, Asia and later Africa, a national movement came into being, which was quite simply a movement of liberation for the people living all over that place, striving for the eviction of a foreign oppressor, the Turks in the Middle East, the creation of independent, free states for the people living there. And the national movement of the Arab people in Palestine was a part of this natural process. And the tragedy which we are living through today, the great tragedy is that these two great liberation movements came about both with the aim of implementing their aims in the same piece of territory, much smaller than California, were completely ignorant of each other. The Jews who congregated, the Zionists who congregated in Basel at the time, had never been to Palestine, except two or three who came from the pre-Zionist colonies in Palestine, such as Rishon LeZion, Rehovot, Hadera, Metula, had never been to Palestine. Theodor Herzl himself had never been to Palestine until much later. And they were really thinking, quite sincerely, about Palestine as an empty country which is waiting for its rightful owners to come back and cultivate it and create there a beautiful new society with beautiful social visions of equality, fraternity, abolition of exploitation. The average Palestinian, let us say, Arab officer in the Turkish army, who was at that time setting up some underground officers' movement in order to overturn the Turkish imperial government, couldn't possibly know that somewhere in a city whose name he has probably never heard at all, Basel, somewhere in Switzerland, some people were congregating, and that this Congress over there in some ballroom could have such an immense influence on his future life, on the life of his children, on the life of his country. And there you had two basically positive movements destined, fated for a conflict which started the very minute when the Zionist movement came to the country, did establish its first colonies in peace, buying the land with money. The war started, and the war has been going on since then for at least 80 years, and is going on, and nothing at all has changed since then until today, except the arms and the dimensions. The arms, because it started with fist fights, sticks. When I was young, it was already pistols, and later on rifles, and then came the machine guns, the fighter planes, the tanks, and one can assume with a great measure of certainty that if the thing goes on, in the not very far future, both sides will have and employ nuclear arms. The dimensions, it started with a fight between villages. There was a kibbutz around, there were the Arab villages, they clashed, they fought. In 1917, it became a war between peoples, the Jewish people in Palestine and the Arab people in Palestine. In 1948, the whole Arab world came into it, the whole Jewish world came into it. Now, both the major powers are deeply involved. The Russian army, the vanguard of the Russian army has appeared in Egypt, and if the war goes on, one can again assume with a fair measure of certainty that we are going to have someday a major big power confrontation there with the possibility of a great worldwide catastrophe. Sometimes when I speak to American students for whom this is a very faraway problem which does not really concern them at all, I wonder how somebody would have felt if he had in, let us say, in July 1914, heard a lecture by somebody speaking about some people called the Serbians in a faraway country in the Balkans. If somebody had told them that some fellow has killed some other fellow, they couldn't have possibly imagined that this would have some influence on the life of many millions of people all over Europe and the United States. I think the question, of course, is what to do about it. Here you have two peoples, two fiercely nationalistic peoples, living in the same small country, each of them claiming, feeling that the whole country is its proper homeland, each of them not having any other homeland, both of them fighting what they think is a national war of self-preservation. What can we do about it? And I would say that even in theory, there are only three solutions. One is one people destroys the other. And I think this is impossible, even if either of the sides would want to do this. The Arabs can't destroy us. We can't destroy the Arabs. The second solution is if one people takes hold of the whole country and subjugates the other. And for this, there are plans on both sides. There is a plan for a greater Israel on our side. There is a plan of a liberated Palestine on the other side. And there is a striking resemblance between the two. Actually, if you take the Fatah program and just strike out wherever it says Arabs or Palestinians and put in Jews or Israelis, you have the plan for a greater Israel. And if you take the official program of the movement for a greater Israel and just wherever it says Israel put in Palestine, you have the program of Al-Fatah. I don't think that this is realistic. I don't think it's feasible on either side, quite apart of being utterly immoral on both sides. The Arabs can't bring this about. The Palestinians can't bring this about. They can't bring about the abolition of the State of Israel because no Israeli, except perhaps a handful here and there, will ever accept it. It can only be achieved by an Arab victory in a war and I would strongly suggest that if ever our Arab friends win a war against us, solution number 2 will turn into solution number 1. We could do it perhaps physically. We are now in physical control of the whole country. But if the Israeli people would accept a program of annexation of all the occupied territories, which they most certainly do not, they do not because everyone in Israel who's not completely off realizes what it means. It would mean that we have tomorrow morning an Arab minority of 36% in our country, in our state. The natural increase of the Palestinian people is 40 per thousand per year and stable. Our natural increase is 18 per thousand per year and decreasing. Even with the Jewish immigration going on as it is today, about 40,000 per year, you can work it out. It will take about 18, 20, 22 years for the Arabs to be a majority in this Jewish state. And whether they are a majority or even just a big minority, there's the people who doesn't want to live in a Jewish state, who think this is its own homeland, who think about Israel as an enemy state. And for a state like this, a Jewish Rhodesia or a Jewish South Africa, to come about, the security problems, the economical problems, the social problems, the political problems just boggle the mind. So by a process of elimination, there's nothing left except for these two peoples to live in the same country. And there again, we have only two theoretical possibilities. One, two nations to live in one state, or two nations to live in two states. My friends and I completely reject the first idea, and perhaps I should explain this, because many people, especially people who are very far away from the scene of action, do ask themselves quite sincerely, why not? Why can't these two people live in one state? Why can't we put an end to all this foolishness for being Israeli, Palestinian, Jewish, Arab? What does it matter? Why not just live together in one state, peacefully, equally, in a liberal regime, equal rights? And of course, if you read the literature of our Arab Fedayeen friends or enemies, this is what they say they want. I say they want because I have, and I think every Israeli has certain doubts about whether this formal program really quite reflects what all or some of the Fedayeen groups really have in mind. Because when we go over the literature carefully, the first thing which strikes us is that they speak about a democratic, non-sectarian state of Palestine in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims will live side by side without discrimination. When somebody says Jews, Christians, and Muslims, he speaks about religions. If you want to speak about people, about nations, you must speak about either Israelis and Palestinians or Jews and Arabs. When you speak about religions, it means that you do not want to speak about nations. You don't want to accord the right, the status of a nation to the other side. And of course, all Fedayeen organizations up till now, including the most Marxist, perhaps the only really Marxist group among the Fedayeen, the Popular Democratic Front of Naif Habatmeh, don't recognize the existence of an Israeli nation. They can't recognize the existence of an Israeli nation because, being Marxist, if you do recognize the existence of a nation, you automatically have to recognize the right to self-determination and, according to Lenin, the right of self-determination includes the right of separation. Actually, the most democratic and liberal constitution in the whole world, the Constitution of Stalin of 1936, accords to every nationality in the Soviet Union the full right of secession. Only no one ever tried until today. Of course, the Fedayeen do not want to recognize this under their program. They want to call us, to describe us as a religious community. And when I once had this, the one and only and first and last public debate between a spokesman of the Fatah and an Israeli, we had this over the Swiss radio last year. When we came to this point, I told him, look at me. You just happen to speak with perhaps the most non-religious Israeli there is, a man universally detested by all religious people in Israel. Jewish religion means to me very little. I'm an Israeli. My identification is Israeli. I've been a soldier in the Israeli army. I'm a citizen of the State of Israel. I pay, most unwillingly, Israeli income taxes. It has nothing to do with religion at all. And it's perhaps one of the paradoxes, one of the tragicomic things in the Middle East, that here you have two peoples shooting at each other, but not recognizing each other. They kill without to recognize. The Fedayeen shoot at us without recognizing that we are a nation and that we are there as a nation. We shoot at them without recognizing that there is a Palestinian nation. But quite apart from what the Fedayeen really want, or if they have a clear idea what they really want, why not? Why shouldn't there be one democratic, non-sectarian state in Palestine? It is a beautiful idea. And I for one do believe that someday people will, all over the world, will get over this stage in our development which is nationalistic, which is based on national political entities, and progress perhaps to a more advanced form of human organization. But today we are living in a nationalist stage. We don't want to look for solutions which may be realized in 50 or 100 years. The killing goes on today. The solution has to be found today, within the reality of today. And here we have two extremely, fiercely nationalistic peoples, perhaps the two most nationalistic people in the whole world, the Israelis and the Palestinians. And to imagine, who have been now at war for 80 years, a third generation born into this war, conditioned by the war from the first day of their existence, to believe that by some good intentions, by a stroke of the pen, we can transform a condition of total war overnight into a condition of total peace. And that is what it is, total peace, living in one country, under one government. This is utterly utopian. What kind of army is this state going to have? Are the Fedayeen and the El Al security guards, the hijackers and the hijackees, going to live together in the same tent tomorrow morning, not in another 50 years, tomorrow morning, going to live together in one tent, in one company, one battalion of that army? Are they going to sit together at two desks in the secret police? And of course, what state is this going to be if it has no secret police? Are they going to sit together on the same bench, administering the same laws, having the same national flag, obeying the same government, working together in the same political parties? Anyone who at all has any knowledge of what's going on in the Middle East, on either side of the front line, no one can really believe in this for a minute. It may be a beautiful vision. It may come about. I myself will not object if it ever comes about someday. It is not the solution for tomorrow morning. It is not the solution which will put an end to the war. And therefore, by a process of elimination, we come to the solution in which my friends and I believe since 1948, because we think it is the right solution, that these two peoples living together in the same country must live in two national states, each of them representing the national identity of one of them, but with an arrangement which will enable them to live together in coexistence, in cooperation, and someday perhaps in unification. And this is what my friends and I have in mind in Israel, and I would say it goes much beyond the small party which I represent. It is more or less now a common idea of the whole Israeli peace movement, which is much bigger. The idea is that alongside the state of Israel, which is already there must come about a Palestinian state which should have been there since 1948, which was not created in 1948, and the non-creation of which perhaps is a major cause of all the trouble since then. We want our own government, the government of Israel, to do the following things. We want them to recognize the existence and the national rights of the Palestinian people as a nation, with the right to self-determination, with the right of a state of their own. We want our government to declare that in a context of peace, we are ready to withdraw completely to the lines, to the frontier existing on June 4, 1967, when we started a war which we thought was going to be a war of defense and certainly not a war of annexation. Thirdly, we would want our government to declare that we are ready to give back the occupied territories of Palestine, not to any neighboring Arab regime, but to the people who live there themselves, to the Palestinians, dare to create, if they want to, a national state of their own, fully free, sovereign, and independent. Fourth, we would like our government to call upon the Palestinian people to create a responsible political leadership to take part in the peacemaking machinery in any kind of negotiations, either direct or indirect, through yarring or any other way, and to become a party to a peace settlement which will be achieved in full agreement with the people living there. I've come here, among other things, in order to try to use as little influence as somebody like me may have in Washington, D.C., in order to convince the American administration people to do exactly the same. I would like Secretary Rogers to declare that the United States government does recognize the existence of a Palestinian people, does call upon them to form a responsible national leadership or provisional government, is ready to have this government participate in any peacemaking efforts, and will not dispose of the occupied territories of Palestine without the full agreement of the people who live in them. This, to our mind, is the only way which, it has been called a plan for peace. I don't like the term peace plan because it gives the idea that by some miraculous formulation you solve problems. You don't solve problems by formulating them. It is an approach to peace. It is a program of setting in motion political processes in the Middle East, and especially within the Palestinian people themselves, to create new political realities, to create a new mental reality, to move forwards towards peace. I'll stop right here. I can talk about this at great length. I'll stop right here because I'd like to answer questions or react to remarks, etc. Shall I call upon people myself? Let's start from here. didn't hear the last.
This reasoning should apply here also, that sovereign state, in a position of power, would not voluntarily give up chunk of its territory to people who have been fighting for the last 50 years.
I think I made it clear that what we have in mind, my friends and I, in Israel, is a withdrawal to the lines of June 4, 1967, within the context of peace. Not instead of peace, not before peace, but within a context of peace. To declare today that in a peace settlement with the Palestinian people, we shall go back to where we started in June 67, when I, as an Israeli, at June 5 at 8 o'clock in the morning over the Israeli radio, heard a very passionate speech by our Prime Minister Levi Eshkol and by our Minister of Defense Moshe Dayan, saying that we are setting out, going to war to defend the existence of our state, and that we do not seek any kind of conquest. This is the spirit of June 5, 67. It is a spirit in which we won the war, which we did not want, and I think we must go back to that spirit if we want to have peace. If you call this giving up a part of our national territory, it depends, this is a question of terminology. The thing is that you may think that the whole country is our national territory. Unfortunately, this is also what the Palestinians think, that this is, all the country is their national territory, and in such a unique, completely unique situation, does not exist anywhere in the world. Compromise, partition, is the only solution. Yes, sir. I speak about the territories of Palestine. It is a well-defined area. Neither the Sinai Peninsula nor the Golan Heights ever belonged to Palestine. They belong to Syria and to Egypt, have always belonged to Syria and to Egypt, and I would expect the Israeli government to withdraw from there in the context of a peace settlement with Egypt and with Syria, I suppose with some security guarantees to safeguard us that this will not become tomorrow morning a base of attack against Israel. But we are talking now about the occupied parts of Palestine, which in practice means today the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, for which some connection will have to be found one way or the other, perhaps by an extraterritorial high road or by any other device. It's not so far apart as the two parts of Pakistan, where there are a few thousand miles in between. These are adjoining territories. The distance between Hebron and Gaza is about 30, 40 miles. They have to have a connection there. But I would expect the two states, the state of Palestine and the state of Israel, to have an open frontier between them, so that the Palestinian state will have an open access to all Israeli seaports, to Haifa, to Ashdod, if they don't want to create a port of their own in Gaza. And I don't see any great problem there. If you ask who is going to do it on their side, we cannot set up a state for somebody else. It's for them to set up their own national state. It can't be given to them, it can't be put up for them. It is the Palestinians who have to do it. And I want to say here very briefly, this is again a very long story, there is a general misconception outside the area about the Palestinians, because you hear all the time about the Fida'in, you don't hear about anyone else, and it's easy to come to the impression that the Fida'in and the Palestinians are one and the same. The fact is that the Fida'in are a faction, an extreme faction, a very active faction within the Palestinian people, admired, I suppose, by every Palestinian as somebody who saves the national dignity, national honor, fights for the Palestinian cause, but is a part of the Palestinian nation. You have still the majority of the Palestinians living in Palestine, in the occupied territories, and it is only our own policy, the policy of the Israeli government, which does not allow those Palestinians today in any way to organize, to come forth, to speak, because this is an occupation, military occupation regime, of course, and in a way it's one of those paradoxes of this situation that we are the best friends of the Fida'in with the Israeli government, because it is the Israeli government which, by silencing the major part of the Palestinian nation, by not allowing them to create a representative Palestinian body, turns over the monopoly of the Palestinian cause to the Fida'in. If tomorrow the Israeli government says, in anticipation of such a solution, go ahead now, we restrict our presence in the occupied territories to purely, for the time being, to a pure military presence until peace is achieved, and in the meantime, go ahead, organize, select your leadership, the situation will change very quickly. Then you'll have a debate among the Palestinians themselves. You'll have different forces in the Palestinian community. There will be people who will certainly say, we shall go on fighting until we liberate all of the country. After a dialogue of 3 years with the Palestinians in the occupied territories, their leadership, but also their people, I've come to the certain conclusion that given a real solution acceptable by Palestinians as a real solution to their national aspirations, acceptable without committing treason to the Palestinian cause, but acceptable by nationalists, that the vast majority of the Palestinians in the occupied territories will accept it. And there's one very simple test, if you allow me. 2 months ago, when Gamal Abdel Nasser accepted the Rogers initiative based on the recognition of the State of Israel, and the Fida'in rejected it, there's no question whatsoever that the vast majority of the population in the occupied territories supported Nasser on this, and not the Fida'in. And Nasser was, of course, mourned in eastern Jerusalem and throughout the West Bank as a national hero of the Palestinians. Yes, sir.
First of all, what should be the status of Jerusalem? The West Bank, it seems to me, isn't enough land. It's only about 2,000 square miles, and we have almost 1.5 million Palestinians. The other problem is that, okay, let's say the Palestinians aren't gung-ho on the binational state, as the Fedayeen are. However, considering that the Arab governments, their attacks against Israel are not oriented toward really saving the Palestinians. They're just as harsh as them as at times the Israelis have been. The problem is inter-Arab relations, and they divert these inter-Arab problems into activity against Israel. So all they have to do is say, no, that 2,000 square miles isn't enough, there must be a binational state, and they continue their war.
First of all, the Fida'in never talk about a binational state. They cannot talk about a binational state because binational state means that they recognize that we are a nation. They have not yet come to this point yet, and not one single Fida'in group, including the Chawatma group, none of them talks about a binational state. They talk about a non-sectarian democratic state without recognition of an Israeli nation. But your other questions, first of all, Jerusalem, we do not expect any Arab to give up Jerusalem. We would not like Jerusalem to be re-divided. We are looking for a settlement which will keep Jerusalem united as the capital of both the State of Israel and the State of Palestine.
Excuse me, there's another class scheduled in here at 1 o'clock, so maybe we can just finish this one statement if you want, and then we have to leave. Just one more question.
Okay, I'll first I'll answer this last question because it's a very relevant question. I understand you, let's say I'll rephrase the question, whether such a state of Palestine will be a viable place if we can provide a solution for all the Palestinians, except those who will want and who must be admitted to come back to Israel. I would say that there have been some very important studies made on this very lately. At the end of last week, there was in Washington a congress by the Middle Eastern Institute, and an important American economist made a research on this. The idea is that, basing oneself on the statistics of the Kingdom of Jordan, if a state comes into being in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip only, and if this state will have an open frontier to Israel and an open access to the Mediterranean Sea on the one side and an open frontier with the Arab world on the other side, and given a generous investment by the international community, meaning the United States, for the settlement of the refugees, economists believe that this state will be as viable as most other states of the world are today. I would add to this that I don't want, as an Israeli, to tell Arabs that you should annex Transjordan to Palestine. It's for the Palestinians and the Jordan people to decide whether they want to live in one state or in two. I would, however, suppose that if a Palestinian state comes about, Transjordan will become a part of it, and of course this will make the Palestinian state far more viable. I don't think that this should be a condition imposed by Israel, as Golda Meir has been doing. I just read, to my great surprise, that she has moved on this quite a long way and is now ready to recognize that something called the Palestinians exists. Until very lately, she always said, there is no Palestinian people. I read this in a Fatah pamphlet which I got in the United States, and of course this is true. She has been saying this. She now says that if the Fida'in take over, if the Palestinians take over the Jordan state, Israel will deal with them. I don't think, and of course this is a great step forward, I don't think it's our job as Israelis to command the Palestinians to do this or this. Wherever Palestinians are, if they do want to deal with us and find a solution with us, be it based on a West Bank and Gaza state or West Bank, Gaza and Transjordan, whatever it is, we must be ready to deal with the Palestinians because they are there, and without them there will be no peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much.